To understand the secret to saving for retirement, you first need to hear a story. A story about a 10-year-old used car.
Did I ever tell you about my $350,000 Honda Civic?
That's Andy Nasr, Chief Investment Officer at Scotiabank Global Wealth Management.
So when I finished school, I'd saved a little bit of money, and I spent about $7,000 on a Honda CRX. In today's dollar terms, if I had invested that in stocks that were all the rage, even conservative stocks or some kind of index, it would be worth $350,000.
Wow. Okay, so what does a story about a car have to do with retirement?
The value of compounding is phenomenal. And that's the whole benefit of investing. But the conclusion is every dollar matters. And I wish I knew that when I was a lot younger.
And regardless of when you start, saving for retirement is especially important now, and especially complicated, because people are living longer than ever.
So if life expectancy is going to increase, we'll call it 10, maybe 15 years over the next maybe few decades. That's not unreasonable considering all the medical innovation that we've had and all the breakthroughs that we're seeing. And as you can imagine, if you're saving for retirement and the prescribed retirement age is 65, but all of a sudden you're not living to 85, you may be living to 95 or 100, then it changes how you should think of saving and building portfolios, because your retirement years, some decades from now, could be longer than your working years.
Andy's our guest today, and he'll tell us what those years might look like, give us some tips for saving at any age, and explain why living longer may change the conventional thinking around how we invest. I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Andy, great to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
So today we are talking about how people are living longer and how that changes how people should think about saving for their retirement. So maybe you can give us a little more detail on that, on the longevity aspect of it. Do you have some numbers at hand? How much longer are people living? How has that changed?
I think the most significant impact of longevity, when we think of how it affects people, is going to be the quality of life associated with that longevity. So while people may be living longer, they're not necessarily living healthier. And in fact, If you think of where average life expectancy is today, so if it's around 85, 86, around the age of 80 is when a lot of people start to encounter multiple chronic conditions.
Right.
And these are things that you read about all the time: high blood pressure, diabetes. But those are the kinds of things that really start to impair your ability to do the stuff that matters. So you think of that lifestyle transition. People want to travel. People want to ensure that they have a legacy. People may want to get more involved in the community. But the unfortunate reality is about 50% of people over the age of 75 end up with some form of disability or immobility that prevents them from doing those things. And as a result, that can be very expensive because you need some form of care.
Right. So if you retire at the age of 65, chances are you'll have at least 10 good years where you're just enjoying your freedom and, all the things that you would expect to do during retirement. But after that, a lot of us are going to start to face health challenges that could go on for another couple of decades.
Right. And it's important to plan for those health challenges. So one of our brilliant economists, Rebecca Young, wrote about this, the impact of longevity and how it affects the economy and how we need to think of this more broadly from a Canadian perspective, both public and private policy. And the real issue is that as people age, and we know the number of people over the age of 65 is going to double in 20, 30 years, as that starts to occur, you can imagine that it's going to strain the healthcare system. So we're going to see healthcare demand more than double. We're probably going to see healthcare inflation be way above headline inflation. And if the cost of care increases, we should put that in our plans. We should plan for having these expenditures in retirement.
Right. So there's a certain amount of government support for people as they get older. Obviously, lots of government money going into healthcare, long-term care, all of that. But not everything is necessarily going to be covered by public expenditures like that. So people also have to think about how they would supplement that themselves.
Right. It's unlikely that we have enough of a public policy response to fully offset that longevity risk. And you see this all over the world. You can look at countries in continental Europe. They've pushed up the retirement ages because they're worried about longevity risk and the impact of the stability on the pension system. Mm-hmm. Luckily in Canada, we haven't done that yet, but this could mean some changes to our policies here. It could mean an increase in the retirement age. It could mean higher taxes. So in many different ways, this is really important for the younger generation to start planning for, but also really important for the older generation to start planning for, because even if you're 60, 65, you're on the verge of that life transition, you're not necessarily thinking about those care costs. And the reality is that 90% of people in Canada think that they're going to age at home or retire in place, which is tough to do unless you have the means to do it.
Right. If life expectancy now is around 85, 86, do we think that number is going to keep growing?
It will keep growing. It tends to increase very slowly over time. So let's say if you're in your 30s and you're starting a family, there's a good chance that your kids could live to 100, if not longer.
Wow.
So as they start to enter into that retirement phase or that life transition, they are the ones that really should be planning to live a lot longer. And this has an impact from a planning perspective, because a lot of the work that we do with our clients tends to be focused on lifestyle and family and multi-generational legacy. So this can impact, how assets grow, how they transition between families, and most importantly, what people focus on during both accumulation phase being that phase of life where you're working and you're saving money, and decumulation, which is when you're relying on your savings to sustain your lifestyle.
Right. I think almost every time we've had you on the show, you've talked about the importance of a plan. And it seems if you're potentially going to live to 90 or 95, you need to plan for that well ahead of time. Do people need to start thinking about that when they're in that early accumulation stage of their life, when the thought of being 75 is the furthest thing from their mind? What do you tell a 25 or 30-year-old?
I tell them I wish I thought about it. Did I ever tell you about my $350,000 Honda Civic?
No.
So when I finished school, I'd saved a little bit of money, and I spent about $7,000 on a Honda CRX. In today's dollar terms, if I had invested that in stocks that were all the rage, even conservative stocks, like things like Microsoft or some kind of index, it would be worth $350,000.
Wow.
The value of compounding is phenomenal. And that's the whole benefit of investing, is you're putting money to work. You're compounding at a rate that's higher than inflation, meaning your purchasing power is increasing. That's one of the things that people can consider if they're younger, although it is considerably harder to save now. We have high interest rates, inflation's still problematic, economic growth is moderate. But as time goes on, hopefully you make more money. Hopefully you have some ability to save, but the conclusion is every dollar matters. And I wish I knew that when I was a lot younger. But having a short-term view, and believe me, when I was young, I had full FOMO, I had YOLO, I had all of it. I wanted the freedom, and you spend money on these things, but the reality is you got to look forward and you got to think of what matters to me. How do I create that independence at a point in time? And it's all about creating supplemental income when you do have that life transition, because it's a supplemental income that's going to give you all of the freedom that people want as they go through life. So saving is part of the equation. A policy response is part of the equation. There's no question that you look at the way that some of our contribution plans are set up. 65 isn't the right age. It should be longer than that if people are going to live longer.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we may need to revisit the contribution amounts or the contribution ages that define RSPs and RIFs. So that's something that could be done from a policy perspective. But as we discussed earlier, relying on that policy response isn't necessarily going to get you there. Right. And the government can look at things like, how do you unlock liquidity for some physical assets like real estate. So there are different levers that can be pulled when it comes to managing this.
So sorry, do you mean increasing the amounts people could contribute to their RSPs every year, or requiring larger contributions to Canada Pension Plan? Are those types of things you're talking about?
Yeah, either increasing the contribution amounts or changing the withdrawal requirements, those kinds of things. So aligning it more with how long people are expected to live, and just the reality that life expectancy is already increased a lot from the date that those age ranges and those policies were set. So they're somewhat antiquated in that sense.
So what are you saying to clients? What do you tell people at that accumulation stage or as they go along? And of course, as you know, as people get into that part of life where they're having kids and buying a house and all that, saving money can be a challenging thing to do.
Well, as it pertains to portfolio construction and how to invest and save for retirement, There are really two tax-exempt vehicles in Canada. You can own a home, you could buy life insurance. There are a lot of things that you can do to amplify after-tax outcomes for people. And that also involves going through a needs-based assessment. And that's why the plan is so important. It's not just a matter of picking the right stocks and bonds and putting them in a portfolio. It's thinking of how do I design that solution as I go through my life cycle as an investor, as a person, and then optimizing it so you're getting better after-tax outcomes throughout the way and really making sure that you've built up enough of a nest egg before you get to retirement so that you have supplemental income. Because as you pointed out, you might not be able to rely on CPP or anything that the government provides you. So you're going to need to make sure that you have additional income to fund whatever lifestyle you expect around the age of 65 or whenever people retire.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about what a plan consists of? If you're making a financial plan, you're looking at the long term, you're a very responsible person, so you decide at the age of 25, you've got your first job, you want to start making a financial plan. What is an advisor telling a 25-year-old? What are the specifics that go into financial planning at that point in life?
Well, at that point, it's pretty straightforward, meaning a lot of younger people, their lives aren't that complex. Complexity changes as clients age. So you pointed this out, right? You get married, you have some kids, you have a family, all kinds of life transitions occur along the way. So the importance of the plan is not that it's a document that you put on a shelf, but rather this living, breathing thing that incorporates those life changes and transitions over time. So while it's easy to think about, you're younger and you're saving money and you're making sure that you're doing everything you can to manage through, as you get older and you start to make a little bit more money and your needs change and life becomes a little bit more complicated, that's when you really start to need to take a look at, well, how much am I contributing to my retirement? Am I invested in the right things? Am I allocating capital to the right assets that are going to compound and make me as much money as I possibly can make on a risk-adjusted basis? Very important concept, right? We get compensated for the risk that we take. So it's the prudent portfolio construction and also all of the other wealth solutions that you can consider along the way. As an example, that young 25-year-old may not need life insurance, but once they have a family, they may want to contemplate getting insurance to protect the needs of their family. So it becomes multidimensional. Right. That's what I mean when I say complexity changes over time. And then also, if you think of the other end of the spectrum, because you see this happen everywhere, when populations age, it creates a strain on the economy because dependency ratios rise, meaning the older population tends to rely on the younger population a lot more, and that can really affect economic growth and consumption. So it's multidimensional, but purely from a planning perspective, it's important to start early, and it's really important to update that plan as time goes on and consider other things that can improve those after-tax outcomes.
So with the passing years, you're adding levels of complexity to your plan. You start out, you're just putting money in RSP, TFSA, first home savings account, whatever, not thinking too much maybe about other things. You just want to start stashing some money away. Then maybe you're adding, as you said, insurance and tax planning and estate planning and thinking more specifically about your retirement.
Yeah, all of that is really important. And this is the fundamental difference between what you want and what you need. It's going through that needs-based assessment. And look, we always talk about portfolios and securities. Our industry, the default is we talk about things on a pre-tax basis. Market up, stock down, how have bonds done? Those are all pre-tax numbers. We don't live in a pre-tax world. So when you think of the things that we can do to improve those pre-tax outcomes, they're really important. And that's where some of the wealth solutions that we talked about factor in.
Right. So you mean the planning has to take into account stock is grown by 20% in value, but what is the impact of that after tax, after you've paid whatever taxes are going to be on top of that?
Or saying it differently, how do you minimize the tax liability when you need the money?
Right.
Because you're going to need the money at a point in time, whether you use it or whether you transition it to somebody that you care about, or you give it to charity. There are things that you can do to improve the tax effectiveness, the tax efficiency of the dollars that you put to work. So there are some significant after-tax implications of what did I own, was it efficient, and what risk did I take, how much liquidity do I have? So these are all the things that kind of factor into the plan. Mm-hmm. It's the life priorities, it's your personal priorities and the things that matter to you. And that can vary from person to person. So there's no real universal response. And that's why it's important to kind of factor this in, especially that longevity risk, because the longevity risk can really have an impact on people in the decumulation stage. I mean, we talked about healthcare inflation and that cost of care. If it becomes more pronounced because there's a lack of supply, which could be expected. I mean, you see right now, unemployment is really low. It's hard to get people in the workforce, let alone find healthcare workers.
Yep.
What's that going to look like 20 or 30 years from now? And what kind of pressure does that cause? So as you think of those healthcare costs and how impactful they can be post-retirement, it's important to at least factor those into the plan and make sure that whatever the expectations are, you can fund them.
Right. I want to get to portfolio and thinking about the specifics of how you save your money. But the last question about the plan, in your experience, do most people do this? Is it a minority of people who actually have that document, that living plan that they update and that they talk to somebody about on a regular basis?
Not nearly enough people do it.
Right.
And that's the challenge. You think of the importance of starting early so you could save. There are all different things that you could do along the way. But I don't think nearly as many people plan as thoughtfully as they should. The reality is that a lot of people confuse risk documents for a plan, like an investment policy statement or a know your client form. Those are not financial plans. So this continuous planning process is really important. Factoring in longevity risk is really important. And we've evolved our wealth strategy to include these health, wellness, and longevity considerations. At the beginning of our conversation, we talked about some of the issues that can affect the quality of life as time goes on. So we've taken a really proactive approach in the sense that we want to make sure that we address the modifiable factors, things that clients can do to ensure that they extend the quality of life, minimize the risk of having to pay a lot more for healthcare expenses. So to that end, you'll see a lot of thought leadership coming from Scotia Wealth Management that talks about why all of this is really important, how to think of life transition, including hearing from a whole bunch of medical experts about the things that you can do to make it all more manageable.
Right. So it's not just about the money.
It's not just about the money. It's also not just about how old you are. It's about that whole transition, whether you're younger or older. There are things that we can all proactively do from a personal perspective to ensure that the financial risk, that longevity risk, is minimized to the best of our ability.
In terms of how people go about it or how they plan their savings, their portfolios, and so on, there's the traditional sort of 60-40 approach that we often hear about, 60% equities, 40% fixed income or bonds. Is that affected by this longevity question that we're talking about? Is it affected by the fact that you might have to support yourself for 30 plus years after retirement?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question. So 60-40 is how people conventionally think of asset allocation. 60-40 isn't right for everybody. So that younger client that we were talking about, you don't start at 60-40, you get to 60-40 over time, because if you're younger, in theory, you have a much longer time horizon and a higher risk tolerance.
Right.
So you can be more aggressive with the risks that you take in a portfolio. So that portfolio could be much more heavily skewed toward equities. As time goes on and you approach that lifestyle transition where you need to rely on your savings for retirement, then you start to get a little bit more conservative and introduce less risky investments, things like fixed income, which give you very stable and predictable returns. If you're a fixed income investor, you're lending money to somebody in exchange for those interest payments and a promise that they're going to give you your money back. Right. So different risk profile than equities, which bounce around with corporate profits. So you think of conventional asset allocation, and it's really designed to fray that risk. It's designed to create a ballast-like effect as clients get closer to that life transition and preserve capital. But most importantly, along the way, if you're starting out at 25, way before you get to 65, you and I have had plenty of conversations about this. Markets are going to get volatile. We want diversified portfolios, and we want to make sure that they're diversified by asset class and by geography so we can reallocate capital and compound it at much higher rates when stuff goes on sale. So conventionally, there's nothing wrong with the equity fixed income approach. But as we look forward, there are things that people can do to improve those risk-adjusted outcomes. And that can include investing in things like alternative investments at an earlier stage. Alternative investments meaning things that don't move in the same direction as the two biggest asset classes, which are equities and fixed income, which there's a trade-off. There may be some illiquidity, but on the other hand, you get compensated or should get compensated in the form of a higher return for that illiquidity, and that helps the money compound in a little bit more of a amplified fashion or thoughtful fashion, if you think of it that way. So portfolio construction is part of the solution for this. And then if you think of what you can do kind of as you get closer to retirement through the working years, looking for things that'll provide you with supplemental income. As an example, we just launched Medicus, which is a pension plan designed for healthcare professionals that does provide that supplemental income for them. First of its kind in Canada. And we really look to continue innovating that as we think of other industries or other people and professionals that might benefit from it.
And is there a need for people, even as they get older, or maybe even when they're retired already, given the fact that they do need to be able to sustain themselves financially for a longer period of time, does it require a higher risk scenario for them than it might have been the case when, you might retire at 65 and would probably be dead at 75? Now, you almost certainly won't.
Something I worry about all the time. I worry about it in the sense that there will be this tendency, if people are, let's say, 65 or 70, and they think they're going to outlive their savings, there's naturally going to be a tendency to want to take on more risk. So we worry about that. This is part of the reason that Rebecca penned that piece. It was that so we could have a dialogue, not just with government policymakers, but with regulators about how to think of the risk that people take when they put their portfolios together. What is the appropriate level of risk? Does it reflect the longevity that we discussed? So as you enter retirement, as you start to need to rely on your portfolio, the point of emphasis changes. You're not accumulating capital, you're using that money, at which point you really are focused on the after-tax distributions that you're getting from whatever nest egg you have. And so that's where the asset allocation can become important. Traditionally, as people get older and older, they tend to own more fixed income. Fixed income isn't a particularly tax-efficient vehicle. So as you think of innovation in the decumulation stage, really you want to make sure that you have some form of income that is tax-efficient, but really gives you that additional cash flow that you might need to really eliminate some of the risks that we talked about.
Okay. Before we wrap up here, what in your mind is the secret to saving for retirement, especially in this environment that we're in now, an environment of long, long life?
Well, Stephen, we've had plenty of conversations about volatility. And one of the factors, purely from a portfolio perspective, one of the factors that impacts investors the most is trying to time the market, pulling money in and out. And that's where the plan helps. Right? The plan is, I know what my goals are. And as long as I'm on track to achieve those goals, I don't have to worry about some whippiness in the market or events that may come out of left field, because all too often people will react to volatility. They'll take money out, they'll put it on the sidelines. And we've talked about this before, but you miss the 10 best days in Canada or the United States, you're cutting your returns in half over a long time horizon. That's part of the challenge. So it's managing the volatility, remaining focused on the long-term goal, not being so focused on what's happening short-term, and most importantly, making sure that your plan, whether it's with a professional or not, really reflects all the complexity and all the things, those life transitions that are going to occur as you go through your experience.
I think we'll leave it there. Although one final question, where will we find you when you retire?
Oh, geez, I don't know. Hopefully somewhere not as cold.
Right.
No hair, Stephen.
They have hats for that.
I know. I can't deal with snow and ice as much.
Andy, thanks a lot for coming. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. Nice seeing you.
I've been speaking with Andy Nasr, Chief Investment Officer, Global Wealth Management at Scotiabank. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.